I've done very well with that community. Some of my biggest supporters are of that community, and I think I talk to them a lot about it.
President's talking there about the LGBTQ community after he was asked about how his administration is actually rolling back protections for them. Typical Trump, doesn't answer the question, and he's also not telling the truth. In fact, his administration, they've turned back the clock by reversing many of the gains that community has made. And on the state level, things aren't much better in many areas. I'll give you a few examples. In Florida, Republican lawmakers unveiled a series of bills that go right after the very community we're talking about. One would repeal local ordinances protecting LGBTQ workers against discrimination. Another, it would legalize gay conversion therapy, believe it or not. And another, it would imprison doctors for up to 15 years if they provide certain transition-related medical care to transgender youth. You go to Tennessee, the state Senate, they just approved a measure that would allow adoption agencies to refuse to work with same-sex parents if there's a religious reason they decide to deny working with them. In fact, many of the discriminatory things we've been seeing on both the state and the federal level hide behind religion as a reason to disenfranchise the LGBTQ community. I want to bring in our guest, Omar Gonzalez-Pagan. He is a senior attorney at Lambda Legal. Omar, thank you. And a lot to get to, so I'm going to break it into three groups here: the courts, the feds, and at the state level. Important case the Supreme Court's hearing right now, because in the Zarda versus Altitude Express cases, as I understand it, a skydiver, he was terminated simply because he was gay. And at the root of it, we're trying to figure out if the Civil Rights Act applies to everyone's civil rights, or it doesn't apply if you're gay or transgender because, well, you don't count. I'm oversimplifying it, but at the emes, is that really what the court is deciding?
That's really what the court is deciding. I think ultimately what the court is presented with is an opportunity to either affirm really the consensus, emerging consensus in the lower federal courts, the EEOC, and advocates that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits sex discrimination and therefore prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or somebody's transgender status. You cannot conclude that somebody's gay or somebody's transgender without considering their sex. And ultimately, when you do that and you fire them for that reason, you have engaged in unlawful sex discrimination. Here, the Supreme Court is being asked to simply apply the text of existing law and not to actually create a carve-out, an exception to what is already recognized to be protective of LGBTQ employees and workers.
I'm going to give an idea. We played a bite there from the president where he says, the transgender and gay population love him. He's been so great to them. I'm going to show systemically here in a macro, if you bear with me for a minute, how agency after agency hasn't just reversed policies that they had to go out of their way to do it, but also some of the language surrounding it. And in no particular order, we start with the Department of Education here. And this is what the president himself said, or speaking for him in his campaign website, 2020 Trump. President Trump revoked the Education Department's order that public schools allow gender-confused males access to girls' restrooms and locker rooms. To that end here, the Department of Ed withdrew even the investigations of discrimination that we know is happening to students. You go over to the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor now is allowing contractors with our tax dollars to discriminate if they have what they perceive to be legal objections. You go over to the Justice Department, the agency that's supposed to uphold the law. They have now chosen to reverse the policy that lets discrimination of transgender and gay people, that's our Justice Department. You go to HHS, they now can discriminate if you're in the LGBTQ community, and your healthcare premiums could go up as a consequence of your sexuality, as well as even your access to Medicaid. And then I go to HUD, and I can't believe this, and I had to read this thing twice here. You have Ben Carson, who's the secretary of HUD, saying, everybody's equal, everybody has equal rights, but nobody gets extra rights. And when we start trying to impose the extra rights based on a few people who perhaps are abnormal, where does that lead? And what he's talking about is HUD can turn people away, homeless people, if they identify as transgender, and that's the government's policy. I can go up and down the line. There's more examples of this, But Omar, to suggest that the administration hasn't advanced the ball is not true. We're going back 20 years, and they're going out of their way to codify it as policy.
I think you're entirely right. Look, this administration has been set in a campaign of destruction, one that seeks to eliminate protections for LGBTQ people in this United States, one that seeks to persecute and expose to harm and discrimination and violence children, transgender children in schools, and one that has really turned its back on our service members that show true patriotism by enlisting to serve our country, and they are now being denied the opportunity to do so because they're either transgender or HIV positive. Look, this is an administration that has no respect for the law, it has no respect for human dignity, and it really has no other use for their agencies other than the promotion of the president's political agenda and the president's consolidation of his evangelical base, because it is a limited base that he's counting on. This has been an administration that has been persecuting LGBTQ people for the last 3 years, but we have seen court after court after court turn back those efforts. We just had a Court of Appeals affirm an injunction against the Air Force just last week, telling them they cannot terminate HIV-positive service members. We have been fighting the military trans ban for years. Just 5 days after the Trump administration decided to withdraw its guidance with regards to transgender students in public schools, we had a court issue an injunction in Pennsylvania saying that that would be unconstitutional. And so we have seen court validate the civil rights of LGBTQ people in this country and rebuff this administration's efforts. Of course, this president has tried to change the courts now over the last 3 years, but I think the arc of history will prove this administration to be wrong, and will judge its actions very harshly.
And Omar, we're not talking theoretical cases here. Your organization has worked, I know there was a case where students in Connecticut, literally being harassed and bullied, and the message trickles down. When the administration says this, even if courts are putting injunctions, people are being green-lighted in their own eyes, that it's okay to go after folks here, and the schools don't know where to come down when the federal government. Put a human face here on some of the consequences that you've been seeing play out in the last couple of years and how a bad situation is becoming worse.
Absolutely. Look, in Connecticut, you have seen a situation in which actually the state has an affirming policy and allows transgender students to participate in athletics in accordance with their gender identity. These students excelled at their shows in sport. They didn't win the state championship, but they were still amazing athletes, and I had the opportunity to meet them actually recently in New York. And you have seen bullying and harassment and attacks directed towards them. You have seen the administration's actions lead to the denial of homes to youth that need families, simply because of the couple that wants to adopt them being of the same sex. So we represent families in South Carolina and from Texas suing the Department of Health and Human Services for their discriminatory actions and for being complicit with agencies and states that seek to, frankly, leave children homeless before they're actually placed with loving families.
And Omar, I only have a couple of minutes here, but in terms of what we're seeing at the state level and certainly what we talked about on the federal level, here's the part that I don't get. If there's a family that's willing to open up their doors to foster or adopt a child that meets all the this is a solution in search of a problem. I mean, military leaders, hardened generals, said that it was working and they had no problem with the transgender population. This came from the administration. They're doing things and they're allowing the ugliness when no one's really asking for it. And to me, that's almost as offensive as the result of a population that already is being marginalized.
That's entirely right, and what we have seen both at the federal level and with a barrage of new state laws being proposed across the country that seek to persecute trans children and prevent them from living as their true selves, is really the imposition of a particular dogma or ideology on society. Look, if you actually believe in freedom of religion, if you actually believe in individual autonomy and dignity, if you actually believe in liberty, you would allow people to live as their true selves. They're not harming anybody. They're actually living in accordance with who they are and with dignity. And the efforts to actually prevent that and the efforts to actually create obstacles and to criminalize that run contrary to everything we are as a country and run contrary to the constitutional guarantees of liberty and equality.
Well, Omar, wanted to spend a few minutes just highlighting that this isn't some debate that's going on. This is actually happening in America. The government pouring accelerant on some of the ugliest fires here right now. But I appreciate the work the organization and many others are doing on it. Please stay in touch. Thank you for a few minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Up next, blaming the messenger instead of the people doing the misdeeds. We know it happens in Washington, and now it's also happening in sports. After the break, I'll explain.